Quorum of War. The Shant Director of War watched as the last of the enemy ships burned in the vacuum of space. He whistled a dirge to himself as he watched an entire species fall, a people too dangerous to be allowed to live amongst the fearful creatures he guarded. His aides and crew stood silently as they awaited their orders. He nodded to his armsman. "We obey. Burn their world, and may the goddess keep them safe in their next molting." In silence, his ships let loose the worst his people had to offer, offenses against the goddess and a horror to all. The crew watched in silence as the missiles approached the blue and white marble hanging in space. His crest widened when the counterfire from the planet managed to destroy so many of his assets. But it was stilled by the knowledge that no planet can defend against an army that holds space. Within moments, his fire began to strike, cruel nightmares that ignited the atmosphere and shattered the world itself. In less than an hour, the fiery inferno and dust storms had wiped the planet clean of 5 billion years of history and rendered it to bedrock. Out of the flame, a hiss against the rage of a burning world, came a transmission. He was ready to ignore it as just another pointless plea for mercy until it called his name. "Director of War, murderer, we are dead and we will not see our revenge. We have sins that you never saw, evils we hid from you and buried in our darkest history. Today we will let them loose upon you and the cowards that sent you like a knife in the dark. You have killed us, so at least we will not be here to answer for our sins. You were afraid? We will show you fear." Something loomed into the transmission, a gray creature, a thing of metal. Its eyes were just dark holes and its face was hidden or warped by the armor it wore. "We will see you soon, Director." He swore to himself. Of course, these lunatics had a weapon. They lived by inflicting death every day. He froze his voice and issued orders that his people had never given before. "It is not sufficient. I want the planet broken. We will continue to fire. Nothing of these people can be allowed to stand. We remain on full alert until I am certain that nothing remains." His 1,000-strong fleet, every ally and co-conspirator, paused briefly before resuming fire on the burning planet. It seemed perverse to many of them, beating a ruined corpse, but they continued the reign of destruction until the planet itself surrendered as his missiles breached the core itself and returned the planet to a molten ball glaring at him with hate. He had watched silently as his people added crime to crime, piling evil on evil. One more last and final sin to be done. "I want that moon sent into the remains of the planet. Who knows what they have hidden there?" As his first weapons struck, they were met with silence. Then the moon seemed to glow, an ominous orange that quickly became a dark red. Then the moon shattered into millions of parts, a glittering rain of particles swiftly turning dark in the cold of space. He looked at his armsman. "Was that us?" The armsman looked at the numbers. "Director, I have no idea. I've never used these weapons before. Probably." The director watched as the hours passed, as the debris from the moon fell inwards towards the expanding ball of molten rock that had been a planet filled with life. He had seen enough. He turned to his crew. "Stand down and take us home. We have done our duty and we will probably be cursed for it, but I never want to see this system again. Get us out of here." The director stayed in his cabin and continued writing his reports. So far, 11 of his ships had self-destructed for a mix of reasons, mostly guilt and some fearing the response of the dead. He knew his own people were not the type, but his allies were, well, gutless. They had destroyed the humans out of fear, and now they had discovered that fear is a deep well with no bottom. Now they were afraid of ghosts, as the humans' last transmission had filtered quietly out to the fleet. A simple transmission, and they were terrified. Fools. Dead is dead, and no one has ever been as dead as the humans. Within the Oort cloud surrounding the burning world, the shattered remains of the moon waited for the enemy to leave. It made no attempt to rescue the broken remains of the mining ships that had tried to defend the fallen world. It had other priorities. Slowly they began building a connection with home, a summons and a report that would bring retribution for a crime. It had sent the warning, and now it would let humanity fall upon its unexpected enemies. Space is dark and always ready to kill you, and soon they would be the face of that darkness. Far across space, deep in the unexplored edges of a spiral arm, a light dimmed and briefly died, then revived with an ominous red color. The AI responsible for monitoring the systems immediately began reporting the loss of a distant colony, and old weapons stirred in their uneasy sleep. Sol Guardian, AI alert signal. Quantum-locked beacon on colony 30,900A has reported an extinction-level event. Reports of hostile xeno action and all inhabitants lost. Planet and moon base destroyed. Nanite constructors are currently en route to the local Oort cloud to prepare a response. Monitoring is ongoing. I recommend a support fleet be deployed. The creature studying the report was vaguely human-shaped, but wreathed in restless metal. A skin that never stopped moving, breaking into obscure patterns as he absorbed the details. His humanity was still sufficient to allow him to mourn the loss of so many children. So many brave souls that had risked everything to continue the great adventure of the human race. He summoned his peers. "This is Commander Silverwisp. I regret to report that one of our children's planets has been destroyed. It was clearly an attempt at genocide. They must be considered lost." The faces around him were equally strange. Human now only in name and the ability to interbreed. The only rule that held the disparate mutations and alterations together as a people. One allowed tears to roll down her oaken face, startling white eyes peering out from beneath a dusting of green lashes. Who would do such a thing? Did we engage in some hostile act? Silverwisp shook his head, the patterns swirling quickly across his face. They were a first-days colony, seeking out our beginnings on a new world. They took little technology with them and only the bare minimum of medical adaptation. Even our beacon was exiled to their moon, no threat to any spacefaring race. He softened his voice. The people of the forests were very sentimental and easily upset, especially if you threatened their arboreal planets. Ambassador Rowan, we will seek out justice. I called you to ask permission to send a response. One of the other members stirred at that. This one whose humanity had been adjusted for the ice moons. One of the few types that had almost entirely given up on breathing save for occasional speech. Commander Wisp waited patiently while the man constructed a painful sentence. Response permitted. Memorial will be built. Ice will sing for the lost. Then he fell silent, apparently exhausted by the effort. Ambassador Rowan's green eyebrows rose and fell at that. She had never heard one of the ice dwellers make such a long speech before. Although their strange culture was famed for its ice music, it was entirely instrumental in form. Another voice spoke, one closer in form to the commander, save that its body was plated in what looked like fine mail rather than liquid metal. It was obviously in a gravity-free environment. Permission granted. We must mourn the dead and seek justice. I take it you didn't call me without an actual plan? Commander Wisp nodded. Of course. I intend to take my fleet and see what happened. If I may flatter myself, I'm certain that I can obtain justice for our loss and the murder of a world. That created a moment's surprise from the others. The old fleets tended to avoid the far points of human space, reluctant to engage with unprepared Xenos. They were fearsome. Humanity preferred to let the scientists, rovers, explorers, and traders find their way out there. They said they weren't diplomats. They were the reason for diplomats. Commander Wisp smiled briefly as he looked around. So we are agreed? I will find justice. Each of the council nodded and signed their people's support. A quorum of war was established and the mission approved. Ambassador Rowan added a final comment. Recover their names if you can. I will grow them a forest, a silent place for their spirits to rest if they come home. Fair sailing, Commander. Quorum of War, Part 2. Silverwisp sat and let his body rejoin the ship, his skin flowing into his seat and console. Applications immediately started flooding in from researchers, the curious, the angry, and the bloodthirsty that wanted to accompany the mission. An old fleet going to a legitimate war on the far edge of human space? This would be a research entertainment opportunity of a lifetime. He checked the social credit of each applicant, cross-checked their references, and issued 100 passes. Out of sheer perversity, he carefully ensured that none of their personalities would mesh. So they enjoyed combat? No problem. He sent a note to the Quorum of War that he had assembled the required witnesses and would depart once they arrived. He had a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't going to be that easy. Ambassador Rowan felt uncomfortable as she approached the Silver Wisp. Common courtesy dictated that the commander was both the man and the ship, and you were expected to acknowledge that. It was truly vast, a gently sloping dome that only seemed to expand. She was aware that he had been constructing it for nearly 10 millennia, a labor of love equivalent to her forest domain. A nagging fear of what she had unleashed on the brute Xenos had dragged her from slumber in the soft greens of her home and into this dark metal strangeness. She made a call to the ship and in clipped tones announced, "This is Ambassador Rowan, signatory to the Quorum of War, requesting permission to board, as is my right." Silver Wisp grinned as he answered, "Welcome, Ambassador. Your rooms are prepared. I'll drop by when you are settled in." Her needlecraft was taken under autopilot and interrogated, then pulled deep into the vast craft, liquid metal walls sliding around her ship. Finally, it was gently deposited in a vast hall, even as the walls were sealed without a sign or mark to indicate a way out. Beautiful and practical, she thought. Her ship unsealed and revealed a forest. She drew in a breath, the sounds and smells of her homeworld filling her lungs and dappled daylight feeding her now happy leaves. She stared about at the tall trees, ancient and real. This was no illusion. This was the work of ages. Why had he grown this? She had no record of her people traveling with him before. She dismissed the why and just resolved to thank him. Her terror of space receded among such friendly surroundings. In the Oort cloud around a burning world grew the true dark, the side forever hidden. The beacon was not just a call for help. It was a creature sent to watch, record, and guard. Rarely would it need to take form, even rarer that it would be permitted revenge. But this time, this terrible time, there would be no leash and no rules save only one. It was permitted to exact justice from the people that had committed the atrocity. Not the governments, not the civilians, just anyone that stood on a ship or pulled a trigger. Then it had been given the blessing of the Quorum of War. From the ragged and broken rocks, it drew what it needed to become the walking nightmare that mankind always knew rested within. Its figure flickered as it tested its camouflage, guns blighted nearby rocks as it refined its techniques. Plasma picked out specks of dirt from dark space as it rehearsed its algorithms. Blades were crafted and blackened, tested against the stone itself. The flickering image it had sent as a warning now become real, a face as cold as space and a heart as stony as the asteroids it was forged from, as pitiless as the creatures that had earned its existence. Beacon raised his face to the universe, fully real for the first time. Filled with the pain of watching those he guarded die as he was held helpless by their rules. The nanites that had carefully built him had finished their job and had left a trail for him, lines bright in the dark for him to follow. With a final message to the Silver Wisp, he resigned from the human race and went to work. He wrapped the dark around him and left his failed post for the last time, carrying only weapons and vengeance onwards. The Shant Council was as miserable as he expected. There would be no heroic welcome for his bloody work, just the sickening feeling that the nation, his nation, had soiled itself in the name of some nebulous fear. A planet-bound species melted into flaming rock. A few miners burned from the sky. This was not a story they wished to hear nor recount. Still, recount it he must. Council, on your orders I have destroyed the uncontacted race that called themselves human. Since they were in no position to do much more than throw a few rocks at us, we suffered no casualties. He allowed the silence to draw out. One of the council shifted uncomfortably and began, "We gave you those orders because the race was perverse. It could not be allowed into space." A murmur of agreement came from his colleagues. Indeed, it was at the insistence of our allies. It would have been political suicide to refuse. The Director of War nodded. Indeed, how could we bear the shame of not committing genocide and annihilating a race that was so very different from those that we understand? Those spears looked very sharp, and those miners were quite difficult to kill. Thankfully, You gave me 1,000 ships to do it." He slowly peeled his rank from his shell and dropped it on the floor. "I believe the galaxy must be free of all threats now since you sent me against such terrifying opposition. I hereby resign. Perhaps the goddess will forgive us. She tends to do that. I don't." He turned and his rank was crushed into the floor as a curt glance sent the armsmen to open the door. The council watched him leave, more than one of them feeling the same. Sensing the mood, the chairman snapped, "We all agreed. We all read the same damn reports. A race that hunts as nomads, a race that eats prey, hunts as a pack, and yet maintains the technology that can build ships to harvest resources in its system. Never could we allow it to reach us. You saw the same projections. It would be here in a generation, and we would not be able to stand against it. It was but the egg of a nightmare, a thing best destroyed and forgotten." He stood up. "In any case, it is a thing done. Pity them, and those we called on to do it. But it is over. The council is dismissed." One of the council, not willing to be dismissed so easily, held up a copy of the warning sent from the beacon that they had officially ignored. "Is it?" The speaking stick was banged down with unnecessary force as the council was dismissed. The question was left to linger in the air. The Alliance learned that while fear is a small thing, that ghosts are a children's tale best told in the dark, and that there are many monsters that can quickly become friends, sometimes the true dark gets closer. The genocide had quickly become a silent shame. The threat of revenge a slow beat in the creatures that had ordered the deaths of so many. Questions were murmured, sometimes to an empty room. What had they done to be so destroyed? Hidden was the unvoiced fear that perhaps it could happen to them. The clips of the fleet melting the world into molten rock, of the destruction of the moon over an offense never even declared or understood. They had been given no reason but their very existence and died for it. Others delighted in the victory, the death of a cancer, the destruction of a threat foreseen and dealt with quickly. How many would have died if the humans had reached space? From out of the dark, Beacon followed the fading path laid by the nanites. A shipyard loomed ahead of him, the obvious destination for whatever ship he had followed. He had no information yet. He slowed his approach, wasting a day to stay out of sight of any sensors, and then drifted gently into what seemed to be the normal approach to the stations. He left his sensors on passive, hunting the right ships and then making his plans. In the shipyards, the mood was grim as they returned to sullen silence and strange rumors. The announcement that the Director of War had resigned sent another message to the old hands on his ships. More than one put down his tools and walked off the ships, throwing their military identification into deep space. They had heard the threat and they knew what they had done. The night seemed darker, the world smaller than before. Beacon landed softly on a ship. He was waiting for confirmation before he acted, but he recognized it. This one had fired 8 million kilotons of ordnance at his planet. He drew his primary blade and prepared to meet the destroyers of all he had been sent to guard. Blood for blood. He wanted names because they had never asked. He wanted to remember because that tempered his rage. They had killed the nameless, but he wouldn't. No, he would kill the known and wear their skin as a trophy. A simple torn panel, and he dropped silently inside.